All right. Good morning. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lauren Esposito, the curator and Schlinger Chair of Arachnology at the California Academy of Sciences. Dr. Esposito was previously a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at UC Berkeley, where she studied biogeography of Caribbean arachnids. She did her PhD at the American Museum of Natural History and City University of New York, where her dissertation work was focused on the systematics and biogeography of scorpions in the genus Centroides. And Lauren's research program is currently focused on the patterns and processes of evolution in spiders, scorpions, and their venoms. Dr. Esposito's scholarly work is impressive, but beyond this, she does important work as an educator, activist, and advocate for conservation. Lauren is the founder and co-founder and director of Islands and Seas, a nonprofit organization that supports discovery and conservation in ecologically unique and sensitive areas on or near small islands, shores, and coasts. Islands and Seas is creating a worldwide network of small field stations which serve a dual purpose as research facilities for scientists and centers for science and environmental education. The inaugural station is in Baja California Sur, Mexico, near the coastal community of San Juanico, or Scorpion Bay. Dr. Esposito is also a passionate science communicator and educator, with work including organizing education programs about the importance of conserving biodiversity in local communities throughout the Americas, leading a field-based conservation biology course for students at Columbia University, and the development of a nationally distributed digital science curriculum. Finally, Dr. Esposito is also the creator of the 500 Queer Scientists Network. In June 2018, Lauren launched this visibility campaign for LGBTQ+ people working in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and STEM supporting careers. The goals of the campaign are to ensure that the next STEM generation has LGBTQ+ role models, to help the current generation recognize they're not alone, and to create opportunities for community connections and greater visibility within STEM. Recently, Lauren was honored for this work with the National Organization of Gay and Lesbian Science and Technical Professionals Walt Westman Award and a commendation from the California State Senate. So without further ado, please welcome Lauren to talk about scorpions.
Thank you so much for that fantastic introduction, Catherine, and for the invitation to come and talk today. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm located on land that is the ancestral and traditional territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone, the original inhabitants of what is now the San Francisco Peninsula, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to their descendants, to the generations yet unborn, and to all Indigenous people. I want to begin this talk with a quote. This quote was written by Dr. Sarah Cruz, and it is, "We are often placed in a race to document and describe species before they go extinct. And this is not a race that we're winning. But if we want to stand a chance at saving Earth's biodiversity, given the current crisis, we have to acknowledge the historic and ongoing role of colonialism and racism within our own institutions, also within the field of arachnology. And how this ultimately exerts an influence on our understanding of arachnids. Yesterday, I spent some time in the Academy's collection, which my predecessor, Charles Griswold, who I saw here, calls the best spider collection in the world. And really, who am I to argue with that? But as I did, I thought about the fact that while most resources, including the comprehensive scientific collections like these depicted here from the Academy's collection, are located in the global north, the most critical need for the documentation of the natural world is in the global south, where biodiversity is the most rich and yet still poorly documented in the scientific literature, comparatively. But I was also thinking about who gets to participate in the practice of science within the global north. There are deep legacies of implicit and explicit racism that are rooted in the foundations of modern biodiversity science, including the exploitation of Indigenous and foreign people during the exploration and making of collections like those at the Academy, the forced participation of enslaved people in scientific research, the distortion of scientific discoveries and theories in the justification of racist theories of humanity, and the ongoing denial of a professional environment that is equitable and supportive to non-white scientists in the United States in particular. For example, in the opening decades of the 21st century, more than 150 years after the official end of slavery in the United States, only 1% of PhDs in ecology and evolution are awarded to Black Americans. And as I reflected on all of this, I realized that today I didn't want to talk to you about scorpions, but rather I wanted to use this time to reflect on where arachnology is as a field and where we're going. So rather than talking about arachnids, I'm going to talk about arachnology. And I'd like to start by looking at some demographic information for STEM and biology. And for those of you, I know that there's people attending from all around the world. And for those of you that are attending in from other countries, I promise you that there are parallels to what I'm going to talk about within your own country. But perhaps more importantly, it's important to examine the influence of the global north. And in particular, this data comes from the United States, which is probably the most comprehensive data available for diversity and stemming from the National Science Foundation's annual STEM survey that tracks who's participating in science throughout their career. So what we're looking at here is a graph published in Evangelista et al. Last year in a paper entitled Why Diversity Matters Among Those Who Study Diversity. And it was published in the American Entomologist. And it really, I think was an important examination. It was the first examination ever of who's doing entomology. And if we look at the very coarsest grain of who participates in STEM, these graphs represent all STEM fields, as well as specifically biological sciences. And what you're looking at in the graphs is a circle. The circle depicts the possible number of people who could participate. And on the left-hand side is represented men with the sort of pinkish color for those that can see it. And on the right-hand side is represented women. And when the circle is smaller than the outer circle, that represents proportionally underrepresented. When it's larger, it represents proportionally overrepresented. So we can see across all science and engineering who is participating, in particular among white, Black or African American or Hispanic and Latino participants, is not equivalent to what the possible participation is in proportion to the American demographics. And when we look at biological sciences in particular, we can see that Black and African American and Hispanic or Latino, particularly Hispanic and Latino men, are significantly underrepresented. But what happens when we zoom in? And we don't have really fine-grained data about who's participating in arachnology, but we do have data for the closest allied field, entomology and parasitology. And when we examine the participation rates within those fields, we can see that we're doing even worse. There's lower participation with respect to Black or African Americans, as well as Hispanic and Latinos living in the United States. But while I acknowledge that we're not doing as bad as some other fields, for example, physics or actually ecology, the reality is that we're still doing pretty awfully. There's a huge potential pool of people that could be recruited into these fields that we're simply not reaching. And really, our current body of arachnologists is more diverse than it's ever been. But really, it still doesn't reflect either the racial diversity of American society, nor the diversity of the people who aspire to train and become professional arachnologists. All of us have either witnessed, heard, been subjected to, or perpetrated racist statements and actions. And we have not been honest enough in the acknowledgement of our past or our practices in the present. We have not been as effective as we both want to be, and also what I know we're capable of in creating a more equitable and diverse future for arachnology. And as a small society, we're really nimble enough to create change and serve as a model for what equity looks and acts like. So I wanted to next take a look at what barriers to participation exist today, so that we can all be cognizant about how we can act as allies and as a community to create greater opportunity. If we imagine barriers to diversity as this path along the road to reaching the hilltop of this wonderful collecting natural area, You can imagine that there's roadblocks in the way of this aspiring arachnologist. Well, they're holding a butterfly net, but we'll forgive them for that. This is a beautiful image that was created for that same publication that I mentioned previously. And as this person moves down this path towards permanent retention in arachnology, there's a number of barriers in their place. The first barrier that they reach is the identity barrier. And this barrier is about a lack of diversity in entomology or arachnology in this case that reduces historically excluded people's confidence and self-efficacy so that they never even consider this field as a potential opportunity or option for them. And what that looks like in practice is if we take a look at what the percent difference from the general population of a variety of cities in the United States that have entomology departments, we can see whether in comparison to the general population of that city, people from historically excluded demographics are as represented as they should be in comparison to that city. And you can see for Black, Latinx, indigenous people in the United States that are living and studying in cities, they're significantly underrepresented in comparison to the demographics of the actual city that they're studying in. And so I think that oftentimes, what's really important about this is that oftentimes we explain away that entomology departments, which oftentimes include arachnologists, are located in places that are less diverse, and therefore the people that they're able to recruit into the pathway of entomology or arachnology, they're starting from a less diverse pool. But what we can see here is that while that may be true, it's not accounting for the fact that they're still underrepresented in respect to the city in which they're studying or living in. The next barrier for recruitment is a resource barrier. And this is a barrier that is related to socioeconomic backgrounds. In particular, that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have less access to resources that would allow them to succeed in the field of arachnology. For example, they may not have enough money to get out to a field site, or they may not have the liberty of participating in a research experience that's unpaid because they have to work in order to support themselves or their family. And I wanted to share with you a few demographics from undergraduate students here in the United States. Underrepresented minorities or people from historically excluded groups in STEM have the lowest six-year completion rates of their bachelor's degrees that are half that of their Asian and white peers. And women in introductory STEM classes like Intro to Biology, sort of a prerequisite to studying arachnology, perform worse than men regardless of their aptitude scores coming into college. So for whatever reason, women feel that they're less capable, and that gets reflected in the scores on their exams and introductory STEM classes. First generation college students, regardless of their socioeconomic background, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, have the highest dropout rates of any single student group. But I think that the statistic that's really important and applicable, or most applicable to arachnology, is that within the US population, Black, Latino, and Native Americans make up about 30%. But within life sciences undergraduate students, they only make up about 17%, so half that of the population. And what this suggests is it's impossible to recruit and retain people who aren't even getting in the gate. They're not even starting down the path of pursuing arachnology as a field. And the next two barriers to retention or success in arachnology are this recruitment barrier. So how do you get people to start studying arachnology? And secondly, and there's a lot of factors involved with that. For example, where arachnology programs are located. Some of those may be in places where people simply can't go because of family requirements, or because it might not be safe or welcome for them to live and study there. And the second is the retention barrier. The retention barrier talks about how there's these systemic inequalities and hostile work environments for historically excluded people that persist today and prevent those people from being retained in long-term permanent positions in arachnology. And what that looks like is this. This graph is the percent of the total number of women in biological sciences throughout their career, starting at undergraduate degrees on the left, and ending in a fully employed, like tenure track working scientists on the right. And what we can see is the trajectory for Latinx, Black, Native American, and Pacific Islander women living and working in the United States is a downward trajectory. It begins poorly, but only gets worse from there. And when we finally look at what the situation is for employed scientists, we find that fewer Latinx, Black, and Native American scientists are employed, significantly fewer than started out to become professional arachnologists. And this really brings up this concept of intersectionality. In the previous example, that graph, we saw how intersecting identities of women and people of color may sum up together to create further inequity than either of those identities may create individually. And what intersectionality really means is that there's this interconnected nature of social categorizations like race, class, gender, and they create these overlapping and independent systems of discrimination or disadvantage that provide sort of not cumulative, but rather amplified barriers to participation for people that identify along multiple axes of historically excluded demographics. And so that actually brings up another point that I wanted to highlight. It's a point that we have very limited demographic information about because we don't collect data about it either within the US or actually within any other country. And that's the participation for people that identify as LGBTQ. What we do know is that transgender and gender nonconforming students who attend university on US college campuses report the highest on-campus sexual assault and misconduct rates of any single student group. That means that they are coming onto campus, which is supposed to be a safe place, and experiencing violence. And in fact, 60% of all LGBT undergraduate students in US campuses report incidences of sexual misconduct or harassment while they're undergraduates. And so what that means is nearly 2/3 of all LGBT students are experiencing these incidences of violence while trying to focus on their studies. And what that is a barrier to retention. It's something that is affecting these students in ways that we can't imagine or anticipate as educators, as peers, or as colleagues. And I think the statistic that really sticks with me always is that for LGBT identifying students who attend US college campuses and major in a STEM major, but participate in a research experience, they're 14% less likely to stay in STEM. And participating in a research experience is one of those things that's usually associated with retention in the STEM pipeline. It's one of those things that makes you feel for the very first time like you can do science and you can do research, that there's a place for you in STEM. But for students that are identifying as LGBT and participating in those research experiences, they're more likely to attrition out of STEM and switch majors to a non-STEM major. And there's some reasons for that. And when we think about what the reasons for that, we have to think about the culture of STEM. At the faculty level, about 40% of STEM of people working in STEM fields are not out to their colleagues. And there's a really good reason for that, because in another survey of STEM professionals, what they recovered was that nearly 70% of all faculty working in STEM departments have been made to feel uncomfortable within their university department by their most immediate peers. And so why then would a student who identifies as LGBT come into a research experience experiencing the STEM work culture for the very first time and think that it's a place for them? And in fact, in a recent survey published just this year of 25,000 STEM professionals from every single discipline of STEM, what they concluded was that people who identify as LGBT report being 20% more likely to have experienced professional devaluation on the basis of their identity than their heterosexual or cisgender peers. And I think that nothing sums this up better than this quote by Allison Mathis et al. In 2019, which is that heteronormative assumptions frequently silence conversations about gender and sexuality in STEM workplaces. And so I want to talk about what that means, what the consequences of that silence are. They're that we estimate, based on the rates of attrition and the number of people predicted to be in the STEM workforce, that there's 121,000 people identifying as LGBTQ that are currently missing from the STEM workforce. 30% of current STEM workers are more likely, LGBT STEM workers are 30% more likely to have experienced symptoms of depression within the past year and report greater intentions of leaving their career within the next 5 years. But all these statistics might sound rather dark and uninspiring, but I think that there's things that we can do about it. And so I wanted to give you a few examples of those. The first is, how do we overcome the identity barrier? That first barrier for acceptance and the beginnings of the STEM pathway. And the ways that we do that is by showing people, by demonstrating that there are people working in STEM that look like you, and in particular in arachnology. So the goal is for each of us is to be more visible and to create opportunities for visibility for our colleagues and peers who belong to underrepresented groups or historically excluded groups. And a great example of this is something I'm really proud of, which is an exhibit that opened last week at the California Academy of Sciences called New Science, which focuses on queer and intersectional identities in STEM. Another great example, and this is addressing the resource and recruitment barrier, is initiatives like this. Entomologists of Color was an initiative that launched last year. And what we're doing is really simple. One of the things that we viewed as a resource and recruitment barrier was participation in professional societies like ours, the American Arachnological Society. And so what we're doing is raising money and providing free professional society memberships to anybody who identifies as a person of color that would like a professional society membership. So far, we've raised over $13,000 and we've funded over 350 memberships. And last year, we funded attendance to the Entomological Society of America for 45 people from around the world and provided them with mentorship throughout the conference so that they could connect and network with other groups. So if you're here in the audience today and you feel like you would like a free professional society membership to any society that is under the umbrella of entomology or arachnology, just visit the website entopoc.org, find the society that you're looking for, or if it doesn't show up there, just send us a note and let us know which one it is, and we're happy to pay that membership cost for you. I also wanted to talk about sort of recruitment barriers and retention barriers. And this, as was mentioned in my introduction by Catherine, is the 500 Queer Scientists initiative that I started actually 3 years ago now. And it started really simply. It started because I realized that I was the first openly queer curator in the history of the California Academy of Sciences, which is a 168-year-old institution. It's the oldest natural history museum west of the Mississippi, and it's in San Francisco, which is the most gay-friendly city in America. And yet I was the first openly queer curator. I also realized that while I probably did know other queer arachnologists, I didn't know that they were queer, because it's one of those things that we never talk about professionally. So I started this campaign, and I started it with 50 contributions of people's stories that I had managed to gather via email. Within about 3 weeks of launching, we'd reached the number 500, which we had called the campaign sort of in honor of the 500 Queer Scientists movement, which had been has been so incredibly impactful for women scientists and networking and highlighting them. And the things that make me feel like this is a really successful campaign and a really successful way at retaining people is things as simple as this. This is a tweet from a graduate student who wrote that they hadn't met any LGBT faculty until they started grad school, and even still questioned whether or not they had a place in their field. And I think that that quote really resonated with me and really echoed a lot of the things that I'd felt throughout my career. So now the 500 Queer Scientists initiative is 3 years in. We've gathered over 1,500 contributions of people's stories who are celebrating their LGBT identity alongside their STEM identity for the first time. And we sort of usher this community of over 25,000 people on social media, creating connections, amplifying people's stories, and highlighting folks who have contributed. And for anyone who's wondering whether other people care about this, I think the answer is resoundingly yes, because our website receives over 10,000 uniquely web visitors monthly. But for most of the people that are in this room, you're an ally. And so I wanted to talk about what allies can do to increase the visibility, retention, representation of historically excluded and underrepresented people working in arachnology. The first is that you should learn. Really educating yourself is the best way to learn about the history and concerns of historically excluded communities. And remember not to treat your friends, colleagues, or students who belong to these historically excluded groups as walking encyclopedias. It simply isn't their responsibility to teach you. The second thing is to make space for historically excluded voices and amplify them. And one way that you can do that is by simply providing platforms for other people when the platform has been offered to you. You should normalize the use of pronouns by adding your pronouns into things like a Zoom room, which I forgot to do today. And most importantly, you should acknowledge when you make a mistake, but not make a big deal about it, because you will make mistakes. We all do. The important thing is that you need to listen to what the other person is saying, recognize your mistakes, learn from them, and move forward. Finally, if you want to practice allyship, you need to understand that it's an active practice. And the only way to be an ally is to be active. And one way to be active is to intervene when you see or hear something that's not okay. You can do that by asking the person to stop and explaining why it's wrong, changing the subject to stop the conversation, or if you can't think of something to say in the moment, you can say something later. Or you can raise the issue with somebody who has more authority to deal with it. Pretty simple. I'm gonna actually skip over this because I wanted to talk about, in the time I have remaining, the 14 steps to a more equitable arachnology that I wrote for you all today. And so what I want to say is that if I haven't convinced you yet that this diversity, equity, and inclusion is important, just remember this. Science thrives on ideas, and diversity breeds ideas. Each scientist brings their background and experiences to the scientific table. And to meet the huge challenges currently facing our society, science must benefit in tangible and material ways from the true diversity of the world in which it operates. So I have a list of 14 steps that I think we can all engage in as a society. The first is that when we hire new people, we want to make sure, each of us individually, that we demand that those new hires result in a workforce in arachnology that's reflective of human diversity. The second is that we need to create a new framework of scientific success metrics. The old metrics are outdated, and they rely on things that are not inclusive and don't support diversity, equity, and inclusion. The third is that we need to establish a code of conduct as a society and commit to anti-racist training for those people that violate that code of conduct, but really for everyone, because we can all benefit from that. The fourth is sort of a general one for your own experiences, because none of this really applies to the American Arachnological Society. But in general, you should advocate for the removal of statues, portraits, other commemorations within your own departments, awards named after historic racist figures. And because having those things up and publicly displayed are harmful to people from historically excluded identities. We should actively diversify the roster of speakers. This conference has been a fantastic one, but you should take that home and do it in your own seminar series, your own keynotes, and most importantly, solicit funds for doing this, because people should be paid for their work. If you're participating in a panel or an advisory board or a symposium, make sure that it has diverse rosters. And if it doesn't, don't participate. We should develop, both within the Arachnological Society, but within each of our own university departments, funding schemes to support scholars from developing nations and then recognize them for the work that they're doing. We should, including within the Arachnological Society, measure and report on diversity and make these reports publicly accessible so that we can hold ourselves accountable for change. We should develop and increase paid mentorship programs with targeted recruitment efforts among historically excluded groups in STEM. Seek out historically excluded collaborators, for example, those from the Global South, for the creation of research and education in a way that leverages our strengths for their benefit, in addition to the benefits for the whole community. And we should recognize, value, and respect the local expertise in the communities around the world in which we work, something that we too often are poor at doing. We should publicly acknowledge when our institutions are situated on land that's the traditional territory of Indigenous people, because those people are most often excluded from the process of Arachnology and STEM generally. And we should advocate for the reduction of ethnic stratification in hiring processes so that we can practices and processes in our own institutions to ensure that there's diversity, representation, and equity. And finally, we should lead by example as the American Arachnological Society and demand that our external partners that we work with and our collaborators uphold our ideals of active anti-racism. And I just want to end this with a quote, and it's a quote from Dr. Jessica Ware, who was the founder of ENTO-POC and an entomologist at the American Museum of Natural History. And this quote says, "Gatekeeping, questions about who belongs, that's old science. New science is everybody participating, everybody supported and celebrated, and that's the type of science that I want to be a part of." And I couldn't agree more with Jessica Ware. And with that, thank you so much for listening. Sorry to hijack your attention away from scorpion biology, but this is what I wanted to talk about today.
Thank you so much for that, Lauren. There are a ton of comments coming in the chat, thanking you for this talk. It was a perfect way to end the meeting's featured talks, I think. I would like to ask the moderators and the first speakers for the next sessions to go into the breakout rooms now so that we can try to stay as on track as possible. But Sebastian's gonna take some questions for Lauren. And Greta, do we still want to start at 10:02 or could we move it maybe to 5:02?
I support moving it to 5:02 to give this a little bit more space. So
cool. Yeah. Okay. So the next session will officially start at 5 minutes to. And you can sort of migrate over there if you need to get ready to give your talk. Otherwise, we'll take questions.
Okay, I have the responsibility of getting the questions to you. So there are two questions that are kind of similar, so I'll combine them. And if anyone else has more questions, put them in the chat now, and I'll keep track of them. So both, well, Rich Bradley asked, maybe these are different citations. Do we have a context or citation for the 121K potential workforce figure, and how large is that workforce as defined for this stat?
I do have a citation. I'll find it and add it into the chat in just a second.
Excellent. On a similar note,
it's from a peer-reviewed published study.
Yeah. I think that the idea here is we want to be able to share this information with our departments, and pointing them citations is always the best way, sometimes the best way. On that note, Rebecca Godwin wanted to say, this is a great presentation. These are things that we need to come to terms with. Is there a citation for that 14% drop in LGBTQ plus students who have undergrad research experience that I can use to share this information with my department?
Yeah, absolutely. And here's a link to citations for all the stats that I presented, except maybe that 121,000 citation, because that's like hot off the presses. But I collect all the statistics from peer-reviewed published studies about LGBTQ people in STEM on 500 Career Scientists, and so there's direct links right there for,
awesome.
For most of those.
Thank you. One last question that has been posted during the talk, which is from Nishit Zebi, who says, "Wonderful presentation. My question is there any such space online where people belonging to these sort of underrepresented areas can connect with each other, especially if they share that same passion for arachnology?"
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and actually something that I would advocate for us creating within the American Arachnological Society or the International Society of Arachnology, is creating these spaces for people to be able to connect outside of conference times because networking is really incredibly important. And if we can build in some of this natural mentorship within the society itself, I think that it will facilitate the retention and recruitment of people from historically excluded groups.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a great initiative that maybe we could talk about at the business meeting. One other question that just came up is from Guillerme, who asks, do you have any data for countries apart from the United States, or an idea where we could get that data? Because obviously the issues and the which groups are underrepresented may vary depending on where you are.
Yeah, so the answer is for most countries, depending on the country, there may or may not be public data available. The statistics that I was showing about historically excluded groups in the United States from the Evangelista et al. 2020 paper, to my knowledge, that's the first paper that has ever examined the diversity either within the US or anywhere in the world on a field outlet closely allied with arachnology. It's to my knowledge the very, very first study examining data like that. So there's probably not data. The data probably exists in some raw form for many countries, but we need somebody to compile it and analyze it. So if you want to tackle that, get in touch. I'd be happy to see how I can facilitate.
I have a few questions that came up that got buried. One from Mercedes Burns, who asks, how do you think about calls for repatriation of specimens that were collected improperly or inappropriately attributed? And where do you suggest I start to learn more about historically silenced researchers in arachnology?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I've been reaching out to some folks, like trying to inquire what they know about people who had been historically overlooked or silenced, or were just simply never employed on the basis of their personal identity. And it's all just really word of mouth. And I personally would love to see us collect this information and create a resource so that people can get to know some of the historic figures in arachnology that belong to historically excluded groups. Because certainly there are many, but it's hard to find the information. As I actually have already forgotten the first part of the question, so can you remind me?
Yes, it was about calls for repatriation of specimens that were collected improperly or without the appropriate attribution.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as repatriation, I can only tell you what my personal opinion is, and my personal opinion is that people have autonomy over their own stuff. If you are from a developing country and you know that people have stolen material from that developing country, you have every right to ask for that material back. Where it gets, I think, a little complicated is when people try to make an argument for the fact that there's nowhere that's satisfactory to put that material. But quite frankly, I think that countries and sovereign peoples should have the right to decide what they're doing with their own material. Send it back.
Wonderful.
It's not yours.
I have two more questions from two more people, and we'll see how much time we have. I think that might wrap it up. Calum asks, are there similar statistics for representation of people living with disabilities in STEM fields, and particularly in our field of entomology/arachnology?
There are some statistics. There's like a clearinghouse for all data within the United States that's collected by the federal government. And there are some similar statistics available for people with disabilities. But it's less clear cut than it is for demographic information for some reason. I don't really know why, because I don't actually know what the format in which the data was originally collected is, but it's there. It just needs to be analyzed.
Sounds like a great project for some people to get inspired by. Our final question comes from Prashant Sharma, who says, much of the discussion about inclusivity and diversity in STEM doesn't account for international scientists. So students and postdocs from Latin America, Asia, and Africa who work in the United States, they are ineligible for most US postdoctoral and graduate fellowships, targeted hiring, and other fellowships because of their international citizenship. So he asks, should efforts to diversify the US STEM workforce be brought in to include immigrants from developing countries? And if so, how do you think this would affect opportunities for US-born underrepresented populations And how would you convince the United States taxpayer to fund that effort on behalf of a non-United States citizen? So multi-part question, I can remind you of them.
Yeah. I mean, I would say like first, it's not an either or situation. This is like the same argument that we hear often when people are advocating against affirmative action. Like these things don't take away opportunities, they add to opportunities. So yes, I think that there should be greater funding available for international trainees. How do you advocate as a U.S. taxpayer? I mean, I guess you call your legislator, but also like the U.S. government is not the sole source of funding. And I think that there's creative ways, and there's definitely creative ways that some people that would fall under the demographic that you described as international students and trainees, are thinking about ways to diversify funding schemes to ensure that there's inclusion of international workers in work that's being done in the global north, to provide better access to the specimens and literature that's held in the global north, while providing greater recognition of the contributions of people from the global south. So I think that that's something that we as a society can tackle, and we can think about ways that we as a society can improve our understanding of organisms from the global south, while including the researchers that are from the countries where we're trying to do research and study.
Wonderful. Thank you for that great answer. Apologies, I have to cut all of us off because I think this conversation could go on forever and I really want it to, but it is time for us to go check out some of the research being presented today at the 2 breakout rooms for the 2 tracks. So I just want to thank Dr. Esposito again for all of your time and the wonderful presentation. So everyone, please give a round of applause, but also head on over to those rooms to check out today's research presentations.